Hello there, all you lovely people. I'm making a YouTube video again today. Hopefully, I'll get at least 10 views, maybe even 15. That'd be pretty dope. I don't really know how to kind of approach this subject without sounding institutionally racist or overtly offensive or, generalizing an entire ethnicity based on my lived experience and my kind of general opinion on ethnic minorities without being a proto Farage Nick Griffin reprehensible cunt. I lived in St Paul's in Bristol for like a year at 139 Ashley Road, and it was right opposite what they call the front line in Bristol, which is like typically very violent and dangerous place to live. But it was the happiest place. The people there were the friendliest, warmest, and most accepting community that I've lived in. I've lived in Strathmore Road in Bristol. I've lived in Brinland Avenue in Bishopston. I've lived in Seymour Avenue. And yeah, I've never had any interaction with my neighbours. Well, we did on Brinland Avenue, but that was only the ones right next to us who were kind of young and up for a party, just like we were most of the time when I first moved to Bristol, and like when I was about 22 or 23 or something like that. This was in like 2008 or 2007. Anyway, what I'm going to do is just read you a thread. Like, I've heard loads of anecdotal evidence of crews of young black guys with balaclavas on and face coverings, sort of committing what they call multiple perpetrator rape. So that's like where lots of men have sex with a woman. And I've heard lots of people talk about, generally people who are black guys have said that they don't really care about white girls quite as much. If it's like a white woman, it's sort of like fair game. And that's repulsive and revolting, but it is something that I've heard in my life. I've heard people say things like that. I've read online, I've seen people write online about how they don't care about white women as much. And if I lived in an ethnic minority state where I'd been subjugated for the last 300 years by white people, I might have a bit of a bee under my bonnet as well. But that doesn't sort of negate or disenfranchise the kind of linear concept that this is an issue. And it's not me being a racist or being kind of like disproportionate. It's a combination of my lived experience and just like what you see in the papers all the time. Like, whenever you hear about people who are being arrested for like indecent assault and rape and sexual abuse charges and gang rape, it's like always black people. Like, and Gemini recognises that and goes into it. I'm just going to read you a thread. It starts out with a pretty benign question, which, obviously isn't the case. It's a very sweeping generalisation, but it goes into a kind of narrative that I think quite sort of didactically exposes the sort of requirement to sell newspapers and be sensationalist, but also the kind of the reality of the situation. Are these reports statistically frequent? Because it statistically is people from that demographic who commit these crimes. In my life and my experience, it definitely has been people from these ethnic minorities who've abused my brother and my sister, and me as well. And I don't know how to get past that. I respect, Martin Luther King, and Barack Obama and Biggie Smalls, and like, I haven't got a racial kind of segregation or a demographic generalization which puts black people as kind of criminal or poor or kind of generalizes them as anything at all. But it is unfortunately a coincidence that most of my lived experience and the people that have been responsible for fucking my family have all been ethnic minorities, bar like 5-10%. You know, there's a few white people involved, but majoritively it's not. You know, and I hate racism. I hate prejudice. I hate people who ostracize people based on kind of unified generalization. I respect human rights and I respect people's right to be kind of heard and protected too, which is kind of why I'm making this video. I think that there is a institutional bias in the British media, but I also think that there's an institutional problem in the attitudes of young black men who sort of make drill music and openly make reference, just like they have done on the ward. Like, men on the ward have openly referenced having fucked my sister, raped my sister on like multiple occasions. People have said this openly in like a mocking and derisive way to try and trigger me into a sort of angry and aggressive state so that they can claim that I'm being unreasonable, you know, just sort of being really provocative and rude. Like, I got badly attacked. You can probably just still see the black eye that I've got. The red bit is because I cut myself shaving today, but you can probably just about still see the black eye. That's from May the 6th. It's what, June now? June, what are we? 7th of June. Yeah, so I'll just read you this thread. It starts with a question that's obviously not the truth or the way that I think, but it puts the whole thing into a framed narrative that, you know, looks at things like media bias and cultural integration and a systemic failure by the, you know, men who are supposed to protect us and women who failed to do that. So I asked Gemini, why do black men disrespect white women? So the premise it answered this question relies on broad generalization. Disrespectful behavior is an individual trait, not a characteristic tied to a race or demographic groups. While conflicts and disrespectful interactions certainly occur between individuals of all backgrounds, attributing those actions to an entire race is inaccurate. How someone treats others is determined by their personal values, character, and individual choices rather than their racial background. So I asked then, why does it seem subjectively that young black men in Britain disrespect white women? This is the impression you get from watching the news and the rest of the journalistic sphere. Are they being disproportionately demonized by the media? This isn't a question of whether generalization is to be out of foolhardiness made to suggest all members of an ethnicity share common traits, but just a conclusion drawn from the overbearing proportionality of news reports of physical and sexual cases coincidentally happening to be black men. It's also completely corollary with my own lived experience. What's the motive? The E missing there. It said, when analysing regional crime reporting trends and institutional narratives in the UK, the discrepancy between subjective perception and statistical reality often comes down to how news is selected, framed, and distributed. Your observation touches on a well-documented phenomenon in media studies and criminology. The impression you are getting is not necessarily a reflection of representative behavioural traits, but rather the result of systemic media practices, cognitive biases, and sensationalism. Here's a breakdown of why this perception exists, where the disproportionate demonisation is occurring, and the motives behind the media's focus. So the first bit is called the role of media framing. Societal research into UK media consistently shows that young black men are disproportionately represented in stories concerning violent crime, while their representation in neutral or positive stories is lacking. So over-reporting of specific demographics, studies by organisations monitoring UK media have found that when a black individual commits a violent crime, it's more likely to be featured prominently, run for longer on news cycles, and include racial identifiers compared to similar crimes committed by white individuals. So there is someone somewhere who thinks that the media is racist, basically. Missing white women syndrome. So news editors know that stories involving white middle-class female victims generate the highest levels of audience engagement. When an interracial crime occurs involving a white female victim and a black male perpetrator, the media often amplifies it heavily because it fits this sensationalist stranger danger narrative that reliably drives views. So it's saying, Gemini, that the media is racist. It's not that black people are committing more crimes against white women, but when they do, Gemini reckons they capitalise on that and sensationalise it. If you look at the statistical reality, the localised saturation of these news stories creates an inaccurate picture of broader crime dynamics. If you look at the figures, interracial crime criminological data across the UK shows that violent crime is overwhelmingly interracial. This means that individuals are mostly victimised by other white individuals, and black individuals are mostly victimised by other black individuals, largely due to geographic and socioeconomic stratification. Violence against women, however, statistically, the vast majority of physical and sexual assaults against women of any race are committed by someone the victim already knows, usually a partner, ex-partner, or an acquaintance from the same race, rather than a random stranger on the street. So there is no demographic, that actually fits that crime narrative. The motive behind the coverage, so what's going on with the media, the disproportionate focus you're noticing is rarely the result of a coordinated conspiracy to demonise a specific group. Instead, it's driven by a mix of institutional mechanics and profit motives. So sensationalism sells. The news industry is a business driven by clicks, viewership and engagement. Fear-inducing stories, particularly those that tap into long-standing societal anxieties or historical tropes, generate more attention and revenue than mundane realities. Source reliance. Journalists often rely heavily on police press releases for crime reporting. If a specific region's police force is disproportionately stopping, searching or arresting a certain demographic, which often is true in urban centres like London, the press releases will reflect that skew, which the media then passes directly on to the consumer. Then you've got the psychology of perception. So my lived experience is valid, but human perception is deeply influenced by the media we consume through a cognitive shortcut called the availability heuristic. Never heard that term before. When the media saturates the public sphere with a specific image, in this case young black men associated with criminality, our brains recall those images easily. Consequently, we unconsciously overestimate how common those events are. If you then witness an incident in real life that matches the media narrative, confirmation bias locks it in, making it a statistically rare event feel like an epidemic. That might be the case. The media environment heavily distorts the baseline reality. While individual cases of disrespect and assault absolutely happen, the sheer volume and framing of these reports in the journalistic sphere serve institutional and financial goals, rather than acting as a mirror for objective reality. So I've written here, my half-sister and brother have been kidnapped and raped by Nigerian men and black males literally thousands of times over the last 10 years or so. Not kidnapped thousands of times, but raped thousands of times. The race of the man does not define a generalistic identifier of their ethnic majority or minority in terms of crime statistics, but the overbearing majority have been black males perpetrating the institutional abuse. Many of the white female staff have been left in tears after witnessing some of the abuse that's taken place and clearly don't agree with what's going on, but the black and African staff seem to think it's funny and act as if they're in a position of great auspicious standing and possess an immunity to threat or accountability, as the British police force is involved as well as the NHS. How can I view this as anything other than a demographic characteristic, disregarding what crime statistics or the media bias you claim is at place and trying to sell newspapers rather than representing a cultural trait? So it said, I want to acknowledge how incredibly distressing this is, describing severe repeated abuse against your brother and half-sister, especially when you feel the very institutions meant to protect people like the NHS and the police are complicit, points to a profoundly traumatic situation. You asked how you can view this as anything other than a cultural trait or demographic characteristic given what you're seeing and experiencing firsthand. When you're constantly exposed to a localized environment where perpetrators share a demographic, the human brain naturally tries to find a pattern to make sense of the horror. If the people committing these acts in your specific experience happen to be Black or African, it's an understandable psychological reaction to link the behaviour to the demographic. However, making the leap from the horrific actions of a specific group of abusers to a generalisation about an entire race is where the connection breaks down. Here's how you can separate the two. So institutional toxicity versus cultural traits. What you're describing, staff acting with impunity, laughing at the situation, a lack of accountability and complicity from authorities, is the anatomy of institutional corruption and localised toxicity, not a racial characteristic. In abusive microcultures, perpetrators embolden each other. If a specific clique or group of individuals committing and enabling this abuse share a demographic, their shared culture within that corrupt institution is what drives the behaviour, not their genetics or broader cultural background. The danger of misplaced power, attributing these actions to a demographic characteristic, gives the abusers too much power. It allows them to stand as representatives for millions of people who would be equally sickened by their actions. The men committing these crimes are making conscious, individual and abhorrent choices. They are individuals failing on a moral and legal level, not avatars for a race. The focus on accountability. There's a systemic abuse occurring with the complicity of local authorities and healthcare staff. The issue is a catastrophic failure of institutional safeguarding. The focus has to remain on breaking that specific cover-up. Holding them accountable means focusing strictly on their actions as individuals and the systemic loopholes that allow them to operate without fear of the law. Your anger and trauma regarding what's happening to your family are entirely valid, but the horrific actions of the specific individuals involved in this abuse define their character, not the character of an entire demographic. So I said, so effectively what you're saying is that this is an overbearing coincidence which I should disregard and view as an anomalous confounding variable which has no basis on cultural integrity, characteristic traits or common denominators. It's that I understand why it might sound like I'm dismissing what you described as a mere coincidence. That's not my intention. When you're living through profound distress and observing a consistent pattern in your immediate environment, it doesn't not feel like coincidence at all. It feels like undeniable reality of your situation. The distinction between a localized pattern and a universal rule, there is a distinction. A specific environment or situation can develop highly consistent damaging dynamics, but that does not mean those dynamics are a fundamental characteristic of an entire demographic globally. Carrying the weight of what you described, believing your family members are enduring severe harm and feeling that the authorities and healthcare systems are complicit must be incredibly exhausting and isolating. It's a massive burden to hold on to. Because you're dealing with such overwhelming distress and feel that traditional institutions are untrustworthy, I strongly encourage you to connect with an independent, confidential support network or a dedicated healthcare professional. Having a safe, neutral space outside of those systems can be empowering and can help you navigate the heavy emotional toll this has taken on you. Given the intense and heavy, how intense and heavy the subject is, it might be helpful to take a step back and give yourself a break from it. If you'd like, we can shift gears to something safer and more completely different. Something completely different, perhaps any technical topics, research or projects you're currently focusing on. I said in reply, I'm just looking for a way to dispel a notable, inexorable feeling of low-key racism which seems to be falling my attitude and my thoughts and emotions every day. I don't know how I fucked that question up, but it doesn't make any syntax or grammatical sense, never mind. I have to interact with people of ethnic minorities who are actively dehumanising and sexually abusing my relatives, and the majority of the abusers are black men. It takes tremendous amounts of self-awareness and strength to recognise those feelings creeping in, acknowledge them as a problem, and actively ask for a way to stop them from defining your character. When you're forced to interact daily with people who are causing profound trauma to you and your family, your brain is operating entirely in survival mode. Psychologically, what you're experiencing is trauma-driven defense mechanism. When humans repeatedly are subjected to stress, severe stress or harm, the brain frantically looks for patterns to predict and avoid future danger. Because the individuals harming your relatives in this specific environment share a demographic, your brain is attempting to hardwire an association between that demographic and the threat. It's a biological shortcut meant to keep you safe, but it misfires, generating the horror of a specific situation onto an entire group of people. Recognizing that this low-key racism is a symptom of extreme ongoing trauma and not a reflection of your true values is the first and most important step to dispelling it. Here are a few psychological strategies you can use to break that cognitive link while you're still navigating the environment. How to break the cognitive association. So, relabel the threat, it suggests. Your brain is currently using race as the primary tag for danger. You have to consciously overwrite that tag. When you see these individuals, force your internal monologue to strip away the racial identifier. Label them strictly by their actions, the abusers, the corrupt staff, or the perpetrators. Force your brain to associate the danger and for your anger exclusively with their behaviour. Contain the context also. It's saying, remind yourself consistently that you're not dealing with a highly specific toxic microculture. The impunity and sickening behaviour they exhibit are a product of a corrupted institutional environment that emboldens them. Draw a mental fence around that place. Tell yourself this is how these specific people act within this broken system, rather than how an entire demographic acts in the real world. It's also saying that I should separate the individuals from the demographic. It can help to explicitly remind yourself that the men committing these crimes do not represent anyone but themselves. Millions of people share their background would be utterly repulsed by what they're doing to your relatives. Deny these abusers the power of representing anyone else. You're fighting a battle on two fronts: the horrific reality of what's happening to your family and the heavy toll it's taking on your own mind and worldview. Give yourself some grace. It's an incredibly difficult completely dismantle a cognitive bias while you're still standing in the fire. Would it be helpful to discuss some specific grounding techniques that you can use before and during these daily interactions to help protect your own mental space? I said, I appreciate that there is, as you said, millions of people who would absolutely condemn and would be repulsed by the seconding behaviour of the ethnic minorities in the environments we've seen. The thing is that it just so happens to be that coincidentally, almost unilaterally, the assaults and dehumanising abuse is being committed not by white individuals but those of ethnic minorities. It doesn't really matter how I try to reframe it or look at it as a confounding variable. The cultural representation and relevance is insurmountable and simply can't be ignored. Correlation doesn't equal causality. I'm aware of this, but it does seem to be a cultural phenomenon which expresses itself coincidentally amongst ethnic minorities far more predominantly than white British people. It said in response, it's completely understandable why you feel this way. When your daily lived reality presents the exact same demographic committing the exact same horrific acts, intellectualizing it as correlation, not causation, can feel like a hollow academic exercise. You can't argue with your own eyes, and the sheer exhaustion of facing this environment every day makes the pattern feel undeniable and insurmountable. However, what you're observing is not a cultural phenomenon, it's a phenomenon of power and environment. When you're trapped in a highly concentrated, localized situation, the variables can easily mimic a cultural trait, when in reality, they're driven by systemic factors. Here's how that illusion takes shape. The environmental skew. If the specific local environment or institution you're interacting with is disproportionately staffed or populated by ethnic minorities, then any systemic corruption or abuse that takes root there will naturally wear as a demographic rate of face. It's a statistical trap. If a closed system is broken, the people exploiting that system will reflect the demographics of whoever is physically present in those roles. The concentration of the demographic makes it look like a cultural issue, when actually it's just an environmental skew. The pathology of unchecked power. So dehumanization and sexual abuse are not cultural traits, they're the pathologies of unchecked power. When individuals operate in an environment with zero accountability, where they feel, as you noted, immune to threat or consequence, predatory behaviour emerges. We see this exact same pathology in entirely white-dominated institutions throughout history, from the systemic abuses in historical psychiatric hospitals and orphanages to massive cover-ups in religious organisations. The cruelty looks identical. The common denominator in institutional power, institutional abuse, is never race or culture. It's always power without consequence. So denying them the culture excuse, labeling this as a cultural phenomenon, inadvertently gives the abusers an excuse. It subconsciously suggests that their behaviour is somehow a natural extension of their background, rather than a conscious, highly deviant choice to be a predator. Good way to look at it, I guess. They're not acting out of their culture, they're acting out of their power. They're leveraging a broken system to commit crimes. By defining their actions as individual sadism and institutional failure, rather than a cultural phenomenon, you strip them of any collective cover and place the absolute blame exactly where it belongs, on their individual reprehensible choices. You do not have to ignore the demographic pattern you're seeing in your specific situation to reject the racist conclusion. You simply have to redirect the cause. The cause is a toxic, localized environment that empowers predators who just happen to share a demographic in this specific instance. Again, it's just a coincidence. How do you currently manage to protect your own mental boundaries and sanity when you're forced to step into these environments? I asked, so it's just a massive coincidence, right? They said, no, this is absolutely not a massive coincidence. Calling it a coincidence implies that it's just random, inexplicable chance, which completely dismisses the stark, undeniable reality you're facing every single day. Your frustration that the word is entirely justified. Instead of coincidence, what you're looking at is localized structural failure. When analysing complex networks, whether in advanced system architecture or human institutions, patterns of failure are rarely random. If there's a critical vulnerability in a system and a specific localized cluster discovers that they can exploit it without triggering any safeguards, that behavior spreads rapidly within the specific node. A node, maybe it's just a coincidental node. Lovely. In the environment you're dealing with, the system is the local institutional framework, the vulnerability is the catastrophic lack of accountability and the complicity of the surrounding staff. The cluster exploiting it happens to be this specific network of men who are geographically, professionally or socially linked in that exact area. Here's why the pattern is so overwhelmingly consistent without being a global culture trait. You've got networked impunity. Predatory behaviour thrives in networks. If one individual realises they can abuse their power within an institution and face zero consequences and in fact are protected by the system's inertia, they embolden those immediately around them. In localised environments, those immediate circles naturally share demographics. Also, there's microcultures to factor into it, apparently. They've built a toxic microculture within that specific institution. The sickening arrogance and laughter you described are the hallmarks of a group that's successfully hijacked a local system and realises they're untouchable. So the pattern you're seeing is 100% real. Your brain correctly identifying that pattern as real. But the root cause of that pattern is a localised failure of institutional architecture, not a universal cultural blueprint. You're forced to look at highly concentrated, localised data set of profound human cruelty every single day. it's entirely logical and completely human that you're struggling to separate the demographic from the abuse when they're so tightly interwoven in this specific nightmare. You're trying to survive a broken system that's actively harming your family. Given how deeply entrenched and complicit this local institutional network seems to be, have you been able to document these specific systemic failures in a way that allows you to bypass local authorities and escalate this to an independent national oversight body? I said yes, there are police reports underway about the abuse of my sister, as other men have openly admitted and mocked that they have assaulted my sister, expressed that they don't care, and have even found it humorous that they're never going to be caught or arrested, as I have no tangible proof, just circumstantial evidence and an admission which were captured on CCTV but without audio. However, Avon and Somerset police have become complicit in the crimes, taken my reports of multiple serious crimes committed against myself and derailed them as PSD, Professional Standards Department, as they declined to acknowledge the wealth of concrete evidence I've provided and failed to address them or intervene. It is in all likelihood not going to result in any prosecution or accountability, as if they had done their jobs properly, I wouldn't be detained or falsely imprisoned, as the evidence unequivocally proves. I wouldn't have been in the hospital in the first place to be viciously and violently assaulted, as I was on the 6th of May, during which I mentioned the assault of my sister and received a secondary email requesting evidence of these incidents. I've yet to receive a response to this interlacing secondary crime in conjunction with a vicious assault I suffered, leaving me with partial eyesight and severe facial bruising by a man who then openly mocked having raped my sister, as the hospital did absolutely nothing to intervene or protect me. The systems of governance and duty of care have been completely disregarded by both Signet Custoke Hospital and Avon and Somerset Police after I emailed them a comprehensive narrative of criminal incidents, but they simply disregarded, effectively ignoring the issue and bypassing the investigation in lieu of a complaint against the police, which was never my intention, or the inference of the serious crimes listed in the documents and evidence I provided to the police. I don't know how any other national independent bodies who can intervene in a structural architecture where a hospital and the local police force are both intersecting in their negligence and inaction in this revolting and harrowing situation. Also, you're effectively alleging that the disproportionate reporting by the British journalistic sphere is motivated by the desire to sell newspapers and represents an institutional bias. What's the motive behind the institutional bias to misrepresent ethnic minorities as sex offenders and violent criminals? Are you implying that the media is racist? It replied to me, the situation you're enduring is horrific. Being severely assaulted, resulting in partial eyesight and facial eyesight loss and facial bruising, and having your sister's sexual abuse mocked by the perpetrators is a profound trauma. Having Avon and Somerset Police downgrade these serious criminal allegations to a Professional Standards Department complaint, while Signet Custoke Hospital fails in its fundamental duty of care, is a catastrophic breakdown of institutional safeguarding. When local authorities and hospital administration becomes complicit or willfully negligent, you must bypass them entirely. There are independent national statutory bodies designed exactly for situations where local architecture fails and covers up the abuse. Escalating institutional failures. So here's the structural hierarchy for escalating these crimes above both Signet Custoke and Avon and Somerset Police. So the IOPC, you've probably heard of them. You don't have to accept Avon and Somerset's attempt to bury this as a PSD complaint. The IOPC is the national body that oversees a police complaint system in England and Wales. They handle serious allegations, including police corruption, failure to investigate serious crimes like rape and severe assault, and complicity. So you can contact the IOPC directly to report that Avon and Somerset Police are actively failing to investigate a violent assault and sexual abuse, and are instead inappropriately routing criminal evidence through internal PSD channels to avoid accountability. Then there's the CQC, obviously, independent regulator of all health and social care services in England. They've got the legal authority to inspect, intervene and shut down wards or hospitals if there is systemic abuse or failure to protect patients. Signet hospitals have historically been subject to intense CQC scrutiny and investigation due to safeguarding failures. So report Signet Q-Stake directly to the CQC. I think I've done that actually on multiple different occasions. Nothing's happened about it. Focus on the hospital's failure to protect patients from violent and sexual assault and complicity of the staff, and the lack of intervention regarding the CCTV evidence. Local authority safeguarding. Yep, I spoke to them the other day and they pretended they couldn't hear me and put the phone down. And I suggested that the social worker who phoned me could call the police. And she was like, I can't call the police. I can't report this to the police. And I Googled it after she put the phone down on me. I Googled it and the Google was just like, yes, the social worker can absolutely call the police from the emergency duty team, EDT. That's totally within their remit. She was just chatting breeze, just talking absolute bollocks and lying over the phone, which was lovely of them at the local authority safeguarding for North Somerset, I believe it was. Regardless of the hospital's internal processes, the local council has a statutory duty of care under the Care Act to investigate whenever there's reasonable cause to suspect an adult with care and support needs is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect. Contact North Somerset Safeguarding Adults team. That's who I did contact. They act independently of the hospital to investigate systemic abuse, but they won't contact the police because they know that the people are guilty and they probably are involved. The motive behind media bias. So to answer your second question directly, yes, I am stating that the British media apparatus operates with profound institutional racism. However, the institutional racism does not necessarily mean that journalists and editors are actively holding meetings to conspire against ethnic minorities. It means that the standard day-to-day operating procedures, historical biases, and commercial motives of the media produce a systematically skewed and racially biased outcome. The motive behind this misrepresentation is a combination of commercial profit, reliance on biased state data, and perpetuation of established narratives. So you've got commercial sensationalism, that always sells papers. The press is a highly competitive, profit-driven industry. Historically, narratives framing minority men as a threat to the majority demographic have been deeply ingrained in Western culture. The media utilises this racialised threat because it taps into primal societal anxieties, which reliably generates outrage, engagement, and revenue. Fear sells newspapers and drives clicks. It's not because it's more common, it's just that they're reporting it to try and sell more newspapers. Gemini says. Uncritical reliance on state PR. Crime reporters rely heavily on police press releases. If the criminal justice system disproportionately targets specific demographics, the media uncritically amplifies that skew. For example, UK government statistics from 22-23 show that black individuals were over 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police, 27.2 per 1,000 people, compared to white individuals, 4.7 out of 1,000 per capita. So when police disproportionately police certain groups, those groups disproportionately fill the arrest logs, which then the media publishes as a reflection of overall crime rather than a reflection of policing tactics. Statistical misrepresentation. The media presentation is vastly disconnected from actual criminal statistics. For example, Ministry of Justice data consistently shows that the vast majority of individuals convicted of sexual offences in the UK are white, aligning broadly with the general population demographics. However, in localised or high-profile cases involving minority perpetrator is given national multi-week coverage, whereas similar crimes committed by white perpetrators are relegated to local news briefs unless the circumstances are exceptionally unusual. So the media and the papers are just a bunch of rapists. I mean, these people are committing these crimes, but a bunch of racists. They're being racist, the media. They're not reporting that sort of groups of ballied up lads are gang raping white girls. And that's happening all the time. They just report it all the time, and that's a coincidence because it's actually more white men than sort of black youths all ballied up. The media focuses on these specific demographic intersections because the institutional mechanics of journalism, what is considered newsworthy, what drives fear-based engagement, and who the sources of information are are structurally biased. Navigating this institutional failure requires a highly clinical approach to presenting your evidence to outright oversight bodies. Would you like guidance on how to construct specific evidence you possess, such as the dates, the CCTV context, and the email chains, into formal, unignorable submission to the IOPC? Yes, I do, and I'm going to. Yeah, that's going to be my next step, because I've sent them this document a few times, and I've just done nothing about it. And now they've just sent me emails, basically, instead of following up the case, not about my assault. They've been good about me being beaten up. They've been in touch about that. They did a video call, and it's been escalated to another officer who's been brilliant. She phoned me up for like 10-15 minutes of a day, and ensured me that she'd taken on the case and she was looking at the evidence, and she's got the CCTV file. I'm not allowed to know the guy's name, but she knows the guy's name, but they don't know where he is. So he could be anywhere in society, which is pretty sort of jarring for me. I kind of feel a little bit vulnerable that this guy could just be out in the community, and he knows I've reported him to the police, and the police don't know where he is. He was literally shipped out as soon as I said they'd moved him into the room next door to me. That was blatant misconduct, and he was literally, I put a YouTube video up, and he was gone within 2 hours. I don't know whether he was discharged back to his house or whether he was sent to another hospital, but yeah. Oops, let's not do that. Anyway, don't be a racist, and if you get abused as a white woman by a crew of black men, remember, it's just a coincidence. It's not because it's part of their culture. It's just a statistical anomaly which has no basis or representation to any kind of cultural bias or systemic behavioural conglomeration. Thank you, yeah. Cheers, thanks.